Feared by every servant in the chateau, a cold and calculating prince ruled with quiet cruelty, until a bold new maid shattered the silence he'd built around himself. She came not to serve, but to uncover a truth buried beneath years of lies and missing names. Her defiance sparks a war of pride, secrets, and forbidden connection that neither of them expected. And as the walls between them begin to fall, so does the legacy built to keep them apart. A silver mist clung low over the vineyards that morning, blurring the edges of the gravel road that led to the grand iron gates of Château de Bellegarde. The estate loomed beyond the rise, nestled between sloping hills thick with rows of late summer grapes. Pale light slipped through the haze, catching on dew-tipped leaves, and somewhere in the stillness a lark called, sharp, high, and quickly lost in the muffled air. The air held that particular scent of damp soil, wood smoke, and harvest that marked the closing of August in the hills of Bordeaux. Inside the castle's rear courtyard, the servants had already begun their work, heads bent, voices hushed. Boots scraped against cobblestones. Water sloshed into basins. A cook's apprentice darted from the kitchen with a heavy basket of eggs clutched to his chest, nearly colliding with a scullery maid who muttered a curse under her breath. There was no laughter. No idle chatter, not in Bellegarde, not under the roof of Armand de Valois. The prince was still abed, but no one dared forget for a moment that his presence governed the rhythm of every hour. He was the heir to one of the oldest noble houses in the region, a name heavy with power, older than the stones of the chateau itself. But unlike his forebears, Armand inspired no admiration among his servants. Only tension, only fear. They called him the Winter Prince behind closed doors. Not because he was cruel in the expected ways. No, he did not shout or strike, and rarely raised his voice above a clipped command. It was his indifference that made him feared. The way he could watch someone ruin a tray of porcelain or stumble during service without blinking, then dismiss them silently, permanently, as though they were no more than faulty tools. The prince did not tolerate mistakes, or hesitation, or pride from anyone beneath him. It was into this atmosphere that Solène Moreau stepped just before sunrise. She arrived on foot, a small canvas bundle in one hand, her skirts trailing dust and mist. The long walk from her village had left her cheeks raw from wind and her shoes spotted with mud. But she stood upright as the gates opened, her chin lifted slightly, as though she'd arrived by carriage. A pair of stable boys paused their work to look at her, first out of curiosity, then with something closer to disbelief. A girl like that, alone, arriving for work at Bellegarde. The housekeeper, Madame Fournier, awaited her in the servants' passage, a tall, narrow woman with a severe bun and eyes sharp as broken glass. She said little as she looked Solène over, her expression unreadable. Solène met the gaze without flinching. It wasn't boldness, not exactly. It was something quieter, firmer, a refusal to shrink. "You're late," Madame Fournier said. "Come." No introduction, no welcome. Just that one word, and the brisk tap of her heels leading down the stone corridor. The servants' wing of Bellegarde was cold, even in late summer. The walls were bare stone, the floors uneven, the ceilings low. No sunlight touched the narrow hallways. Madame Fournier explained nothing as she walked, only offered curt instructions over her shoulder. Wake at 5. Never enter the main hall unbidden. Speak only when addressed, and under no circumstance ever, interrupt the prince. "And if he speaks to you directly," she added as they reached the scullery door, "you will lower your eyes and answer only what is asked. No more." Solène gave a short nod. Her hands were clasped in front of her, fingers laced tightly. She was given a place at the wash basins where copper pots were stacked high from last night's supper. The kitchen was already alive with motion, the head cook bellowing for more flour, a girl scraping fish scales into a bucket, 2 boys peeling potatoes so fast their knuckles bled. No one looked up when Solène joined them. She rolled up her sleeves and began without instruction. The water was cold, The copper stung her fingers, but her expression didn't change. By the end of the hour, a few of the maids had noticed her. A girl with ink-dark hair whispered to another, glancing over her shoulder. "That one's not like the others," she muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "She don't blink when Fournier barks." Another girl replied, "She'll be gone by end of week. They all are." "She won't last that long," the first said. "Not if she gets near him." It was nearly midday when everything changed. The quiet rupture came with the unexpected twist of an ankle. A senior chambermaid had fallen on the stairs while delivering linens to the prince's apartments. There was no time to spare, and no one else available. Madame Fournier turned to the scullery, her eyes narrowing. "You," she said, pointing at Solène. Without hesitation, Solène wiped her hands, accepted the neatly folded linen sheets, and followed the housekeeper up the narrow service stairs that climbed behind the walls of the chateau. The passage smelled of oil and old plaster, lit only by wall-mounted sconces that flickered as they climbed. At the top, the stair opened into a corridor unlike any she had seen so far. The walls were paneled in oak, the carpet deep underfoot. There was no sound, except the faint ticking of a clock somewhere deeper in the wing. Madame Fournier paused before a set of tall double doors with gilded trim. She turned to Solène, her voice low and cold. "You will knock once. Enter when told. Place the linens on the ottoman near the fireplace. Speak to no one. Look at nothing. If he gives an order, obey. Do you understand?" Solène nodded once. Madame Fournier hesitated a fraction of a second longer than usual, as if about to say something more, then thought better of it and turned sharply away. Left alone, Solène drew a quiet breath and stepped forward. Her knuckles brushed the wood once, firm, calm. Silence. Then, "Entrez." She opened the door. The room was warm with filtered light, the curtains drawn halfway to keep out the glare. A faint breeze stirred the heavy velvet, bringing with it the distant scent of lavender and horses. The prince's apartments were richly appointed, but not overly decorated, every piece deliberate, masculine, coldly elegant. A map of the region stretched across one wall. Another held a portrait of an officer on horseback, saber drawn. Armand de Valois sat in a high-backed chair near the hearth, one booted leg crossed over the other, sleeves rolled to his forearms, a newspaper held in one hand. He was not yet dressed formally for the day, his cravat undone, his dark hair damp from a recent wash, curling slightly at the nape. His gaze lifted as she entered. He didn't speak at first. His eyes, pale and sharp, fixed on hers with quiet intensity. Solène took 3 steps forward, placed the linens carefully on the ottoman near the fireplace, and turned to leave. "Wait," he said. She stopped. His voice was not harsh. It was refined, precise. It held no warmth. "Remove your shoes," he said. "You've dirtied the carpet." Solène did not move. A breath passed, then another. Outside the tall windows, a bird trilled once, sharply, and went still. Armand lowered the newspaper slowly. His posture remained relaxed, but the silence lengthened into something deliberate. His gaze stayed on her, awaiting compliance. Solène looked back at him, not defiantly, but with stillness. Not a tremor in her hands, not a flicker of her gaze. She did not remove her shoes. She did not bow. The folded linen in her arms remained untouched, creased precisely along the edge. She remained perfectly, deliberately still. Armand said nothing. Not yet. The space between them thickened. Solène could feel the shape of it. Not hostility, not yet, but something more dangerous. The awareness of a line being drawn. One she had not crossed, but had refused to acknowledge. The prince's gaze didn't waver. He studied her with an expression that was both detached and sharply attentive, as though testing the limits of an unfamiliar weapon. She stood near the ottoman, the folds of her simple muslin skirt brushing against her ankles. Her breath was quiet but measured, her fingers still gently curled from where they had held the linen, The quiet stretched. The only movement in the room, the slow flicker of flames in the hearth, and the subtle shift of his hand as he folded the newspaper and set it aside on the chair arm. He rose. The motion was fluid, unhurried. He didn't reach for a bell, didn't summon a footman. There was no fury in his steps, only deliberation, the kind of quiet that made the hairs lift at the back of the neck. He walked to her, each step echoing softly against the carpeted floorboards, until the distance between them had vanished to less than the length of an outstretched hand. She had to tilt her head slightly to meet his gaze. He was taller than she had expected. He smelled faintly of soap and horses, of warm linen and wood smoke. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were too sharp to be empty. They moved over her features, searching, dissecting, expecting to find something. "Do you not hear well?" he asked at last. His tone was mild. It was not a question meant to be answered. Solène said nothing, not out of confusion, and not out of fear. There was a trace of heat behind her sternum, but it was the kind that steadied her rather than unbalanced her. Her silence was not uncertain. It was intentional. Armand's jaw shifted slightly, a minute clench of muscle. He had expected either flustered obedience or immediate defiance. But this quiet refusal to be diminished, it unsettled something in him. Her stillness, the unwavering calm in her posture, as if she understood something about the nature of power that others did not. He spoke again, more slowly. "I gave you an order." The silence that followed was louder than words. Solène's pulse moved beneath her skin, but her voice did not rise. She didn't lower her eyes. There was no insolence in her gaze, only steadiness. "I serve where I'm needed," she said carefully, her voice smooth and low. "Not where I'm humiliated." A heartbeat, then another. Armand's brows lifted, barely. Surprise flickered through his eyes, not because of what she had said, but because she had said anything at all, that she had the presence of mind to weigh each word, to give him something measured rather than impetuous. He stepped back, not out of concession, but consideration. He studied her again, this time with a frown just beginning to form at the corner of his mouth. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the windows, his hands clasped behind him. He stood there a moment, the light behind him drawing long shadows across the carpet. "You may go," he said, still facing the glass. Solène didn't wait. She turned with silent precision and crossed the room, her heart no longer calm, but thudding heavily now against her ribs. She felt it in her throat, in her wrists, in the base of her spine. As she reached the door, she didn't rush. She didn't look back. Outside, the corridor felt colder than before. She walked quickly down the passage, retracing the stone stairs, hearing only the faint creak of her soles against the wooden steps. By the time she returned to the scullery, her sleeves were damp from the linens, and her cheeks flushed from tension she hadn't shown upstairs. The other maids looked up at her return. One of them nearly dropped a ladle into a pot of broth. Another stopped kneading dough mid-motion. They had expected her to return shaken, if not dismissed entirely. She said nothing. Madame Fournier appeared within minutes. Her expression was unreadable, but her voice was like ice cracking over a frozen lake. "In my office, now." Solène followed her without protest. The housekeeper's quarters were narrow and lined with shelves filled with neat rows of inventory records. A crucifix hung above the door. A ledger lay open on the desk, its pages filled with names and duties assigned with mathematical precision. "Do you think you're clever?" Fournier asked, as soon as the door clicked shut behind them. "Do you imagine for a moment that your attitude will be tolerated in this house?" "I imagine it depends on what's expected," Solène replied softly. "You were instructed to obey. I was instructed not to be noticed." Madame Fournier's nostrils flared. She paced once behind the desk, then stopped abruptly. Her eyes settled on Solène with the weight of someone who had trained many girls before and seen most of them break. "You may have earned yourself a warning," she said, "but only because he let you walk out. If he calls for your dismissal later, I'll carry it out without hesitation." Solène nodded. There was no anger in her posture, no fear either, only something grounded, rooted. She was released without further rebuke. As she left the office, she caught fragments of whispers from two younger girls hovering near the pantry door. "She's mad. Standing like that. Just standing." I swear he looked at her like he didn't know what to do with her. Later, as dusk gathered over the vineyards and lanterns were lit one by one in the courtyard, the tension in the chateau lingered like perfume in a closed room. Footsteps were quicker, voices lower. Someone broke a plate in the kitchens and was sent out with her apron clutched to her chest. Solène was not dismissed. She ate supper in silence, seated among the lowest ranks of staff. Her bowl of stew went cold in front of her. No one dared ask what had happened upstairs. By nightfall, a damp wind rose through the hills. The chateau's windows rattled softly. A storm threatened on the horizon, though the sky was still cloudless. Solène lay awake on her narrow cot in the servants' dormitory, listening to the slow creaks of the wooden beams overhead. She could feel the unease gathering in the walls around her, not just from what had occurred, but from what hadn't. She didn't know why he had let her go, but she knew it hadn't been out of mercy. In the west wing, past gilded doors and heavy tapestries, Armand de Valois sat alone in his study, a glass of brandy untouched on the side table. His fire had burned low. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling with a frown he didn't bother to conceal. He could not stop seeing her face, those eyes that did not lower. He could not stop remembering the strange quiet that had fallen between them. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and then, as the bell for second watch chimed through the halls, a page boy appeared at the servant's door with a folded note addressed in the prince's hand. Solène was to attend him again, at the midday meal, in the main dining salon. The chateau's great dining salon had not been used for private service in weeks. Long and solemn, its high ceilings arched above gilded panels and dark walnut walls, adorned with paintings of ancestors who stared out with proud, unsmiling faces. The chandelier above, wrought iron and crystal, hung like a frozen crown over the long oak table. Only a single place had been set, a single chair, a single figure who would sit at the head. Solène had been awake before the bell rang. She hadn't slept through the night, though she'd lain still, listening to the breath of the others in the dormitory, the occasional creak of bed springs, the quiet hush of night through the shuttered windows. Her limbs were heavy with the kind of tension that numbs rather than trembles. When the page boy had delivered the note, his eyes wide as if afraid the parchment might burn through his hands, she had taken it without expression. There had been no instructions in the message, only her name and the hour and the destination. No scullery maid was ever sent to serve in the prince's dining salon. By the time the castle stirred into full morning, Solène was already dressed, her apron crisply tied, her hair twisted and pinned neatly beneath the plain linen cap. Madame Fournier did not speak to her. The kitchen staff fell silent when she passed. A footman tried not to stare as she walked through the servants' corridor leading to the dining salon, escorted only by the hush of her own footsteps and the rustle of her skirts. When she reached the tall doors, a house steward stood waiting. He didn't open them for her. He didn't even speak. Solène exhaled slowly, then pressed both hands to the door and pushed inward. Light filtered in through the towering windows on the far wall. Sunlight warmed the wooden floors in long, pale strips. The table had been laid with gleaming silver, white linen, and crystal goblets. A decanter of deep red wine stood unopened near the center. A single white rose lay beside the folded napkin. Armand de Valois stood by the hearth, facing the fire though it had long gone cold. He didn't look at her as she entered. He didn't motion for her to approach. She moved forward without waiting, as if she belonged there. Her steps were soft but sure. At the sideboard, she poured the wine slowly into the goblet set at his place. Not too quickly, not too slow. Her hand didn't tremble, though she could feel the pulse in her wrist tightening. He turned as the liquid reached the halfway point. "You arrived on time," he said. She replaced the decanter and gave no reply. He crossed the room, taking his seat at the head of the table with the ease of a man born to command. She moved to his side, adjusting the placement of the fork, smoothing the corner of the napkin. Her nearness was not submissive, it was deliberate. He ate in silence for a time. The meal was modest: roast pigeon, a puree of turnip, a baked apple sliced neatly onto a porcelain plate rimmed with gold. His knife moved with quiet precision. He didn't glance at her, but his awareness was palpable, a constant pressure in the space between them. Then he spoke. "What is your name?" She hesitated, just briefly. "Solène," she answered. "Solène what?" "Moreau." He nodded once, slowly, as if tasting the syllables in his mind. "Where are you from?" "A village near Saint-Emilion," she said. He drank his wine, never taking his eyes from her. "And before Bellegarde?" "Where were you employed?" "At a convent. Laundress." "Did they teach you insolence there?" Her heart did not jump. She had expected the blow. Still, she answered carefully. "They taught me silence. I learned the rest elsewhere." Armand's fingers paused on the rim of his glass. He turned his head slightly, watching her now with full attention. The air between them changed. The meal, the setting, the formal distance. They remained, but something less visible shifted. He was weighing her again, testing, and she felt it. "The servants fear you," she said quietly. He lifted a brow. "Do you?" "No." "Why not?" She met his gaze, her voice low. "Because fear is a choice, and I don't give mine easily." A faint smile touched the edge of his mouth, but it wasn't kind. It was more like recognition. He set the goblet down. "You believe yourself above the others?" "No," she said, "only harder to break." The silence that followed was not awkward. It was tense, charged, like a drawn bowstring between them. A footman entered at the far end, carrying a tray of bread, and immediately froze as he caught sight of Solène standing so near to the prince. The bread nearly slipped from the silver platter. Armand waved the footman off without speaking. The door closed again. Solène stepped back half a pace, returning to the decanter, refilling his glass without asking. Her movements were composed, but inside her chest, the tension coiled tighter. She didn't know what game he was playing, only that it was deliberate, and that it had nothing to do with wine or service. He leaned back in his chair. "You've made quite the impression," he said. "My steward thinks you should be dismissed." "Why haven't you, then?" He didn't answer. The fire crackled softly. Outside the high windows, the vineyard stretched down the hills in lines of green and gold. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and beeswax, the scent of the roast still lingering faintly in the air. Solène folded her hands before her, saying nothing more. Armand studied her for a long moment. His voice, when he spoke again, had cooled. "You're not clever enough to deceive me, and not important enough to interest me." Her chin lifted slightly. "Then why am I here?" This time the pause was longer. He did not blink. He did not smile. He reached for his glass again and took a slow sip. Then he said it. "Because I want to know what you're hiding." The footman standing by the wall inhaled sharply. The sound was quiet, but audible in the breathless silence that followed. Armand's eyes had not left her. Solène stood still, and in the next moment, he rose from the table. The legs of the chair scraped faintly as Armand rose, the sound soft but deliberate against the hush of the room. Solène didn't move. Her eyes remained steady on his face, but her spine straightened another inch, bracing for whatever came next. He didn't speak, didn't pace. He simply stood there, watching her with the stillness of someone used to being the one observed, never the one questioned. The midday light from the tall windows threw long, golden bars across the floor, cutting the shadow of his figure into sharp lines. His expression held no anger, No amusement, only precision. Solène breathed slowly. Once, twice. She kept her hands clasped in front of her apron, every muscle trained to stillness, though she could feel the beginnings of heat gathering at the base of her neck. When he stepped toward her, it was unhurried, no threat in his gait, just intention. He stopped only a foot away, the fabric of his coat nearly brushing hers with each breath. Up close, he looked like a portrait from one of the walls, flawless, austere, but alive in a way those oil-painted faces were not. His mouth was firm, the line of his jaw shadowed faintly with stubble he hadn't bothered to shave, and his eyes, so pale they might have looked cold from a distance, now seemed startlingly awake. "You presume much," he said finally, his voice low. Solène didn't answer. Armand tilted his head, watching her like someone studying the fault lines in a statue. "I ask again," he murmured. "What are you hiding?" The words held no drama, no accusation. That made them sharper, more dangerous. Solène held his gaze. Not to challenge, not to defy, but because she refused to give away anything that wasn't earned. The truth in her chest, wrapped tightly in silence, pressed against her ribs like a thorn. But she said nothing, gave him nothing. He didn't look away. After a long moment, he exhaled softly, and something in his posture shifted. Not softer, just less rigid. "Come with me," he said. Then he turned and walked out of the room. Solène hesitated only a second before following. She kept 3 paces behind him as they moved through the corridors, past the great salon, down a narrower hall lined with arched windows that looked out over the eastern vineyards. The chateau's hush was deeper here, a more private wing. Footsteps echoed differently off the stone, and the scent of old paper and cedar thickened in the air. He opened a door at the end of the hall and stepped aside, waiting for her to enter first. She didn't hesitate, not outwardly. Inside, her mind turned over itself. The room was his study, smaller than the salon, but richer. A writing desk stood beneath a window, its surface cluttered with papers, sealed envelopes, and a leather-bound journal. Shelves rose to the ceiling on 2 walls, filled with ledgers, books, maps. A pair of armchairs faced a cold hearth. Everything was arranged with careful purpose, not excessive, but precise. Armand closed the door behind them. "I dislike riddles," he said. Solène looked at him, then stepped quietly toward the desk, but didn't touch anything. "I didn't come here to play games," she said. "No?" He moved behind the desk and rested his hand on the journal. "Then tell me why a laundress from a convent stares me in the eye like she's the one owed answers." She didn't flinch. She let the silence stretch between them. He waited. When no answer came, he opened the journal and pulled out a page from beneath it. A list of names. She couldn't read them from where she stood, but the shape of the ink, the slope of the script, it was official. He tapped one name. "This man, he's from your village, isn't he?" Her pulse stuttered. She didn't answer. That was answer enough. Armand narrowed his eyes. "You knew him." Still, she said nothing. He dropped the page onto the desk and folded his arms, as if expecting her to fill the silence. When she didn't, he walked past her, close enough that she felt the shift in air between them, and stood before the hearth. "Tell me why you're here," he said quietly, "or I'll find out without your help." The quiet in the room grew heavier. Solène didn't move, but for the first time, something inside her faltered. He had reached too close to the edge of it now, too near the truth she'd hidden beneath weeks of silence and obedience. She had known it would come. Known that Bellegarde's walls would not protect her forever, but still, the reality of it burned. She turned toward him slowly. "I'm here to work," she said. "No." His voice was sharp, not loud, but immediate. "You're here for something else." His gaze raked over her. "You don't behave like the others. You're quiet, but not submissive. You listen, but not as a servant listens. You hold yourself like someone used to being heard." She said nothing. His jaw set. "You're either very bold or very desperate." Solène looked down, not from guilt, but from the weight of the decision before her, to speak or to wait. The fireless hearth was filled with shadows. Her own reflection ghosted faintly in the window glass. She took a breath. The truth pressed harder now, rising against her ribs. But before she could speak, a sound outside shattered the stillness. A sharp clatter. Armand turned, striding to the door, yanking it open just in time to see a maid running past with a cry. "In the courtyard! Someone! He's shouting!" Another servant ran past. Solène followed Armand as he strode swiftly through the hall, his steps clipped, controlled, but urgent. They reached the main staircase, descended rapidly, and pushed through the side doors into the open air. The courtyard was chaos. A wooden cart had overturned, one wheel broken, spilling crates of produce across the stones. A man, one of the estate's workers, stood beside it, shouting hoarsely at two of the guards. "Thieves!" he cried. "You take our share and leave us starving. Your steward's promises mean nothing." Several more workers had gathered near the gates. Others stood frozen, watching. Solène saw the tension lock into Armand's shoulders. He stepped forward, but the man turned on him at once. "Your lands were bought with our blood," he spat. "Your cellars full while our children eat bark." Guards closed in around the man. One grabbed his arm. "Enough!" the guard barked. Armand raised a hand, stilling them. The man's face was lined with exhaustion, streaked with dirt and desperation. Armand's eyes dropped to the spilled cart, then lifted again. "Whose orders were given for this seizure?" he asked the nearest guard. The guard looked uncertain. "The steward. Yesterday, after inspection." Armand's mouth flattened. Solène watched from the edge of the gathering, heart pounding. Something in the man's words had stirred her. Not just the anger, but the names, the pattern. The prince turned to issue a command to one of the guards, his voice low. Then he looked up, his gaze sweeping the courtyard, searching, and his eyes landed on her. Not just a glance, a pause, a recognition, a question. Then he turned away and mounted the stairs again without a word. Solène stood frozen. Moments later, a page approached from the shadows of the corridor, breathless. "You're to wait in the prince's study," he said, "until he returns." She watched the boy retreat, then turned toward the doors, unaware that someone else had been standing in the passage just beyond the archway, watching the entire exchange from the dark. The study was quiet when she entered. Solène stepped across the threshold, her shoes soundless against the thick rug. The door closed behind her with a weighty click, sealing her into the one room in the chateau where silence carried consequence. The curtains were open now, letting in slanted afternoon light that fell across the desk in wide amber bands. Dust swirled through it like flecks of gold suspended in still water. She didn't sit. Instead, she stood near the hearth, where the coals had long since gone cold. The firewood in the grate was unburned, laid carefully by hands that expected warmth to be requested later, not given freely. The scent of parchment, ink, and wax oil mingled faintly in the air. Beyond the windows, a breeze moved gently through the vineyard, shifting the rows of grapevines into slow ripples. She should not have been there alone. And yet, the page boy's instructions had been clear. Wait in the study until the prince returned. Solène turned toward the desk. The clutter from earlier remained. Ledgers and pages, some rolled and tied with string, others scattered across the surface. She moved closer, careful not to disturb anything. A page lay half exposed at the edge of the desk, a list of names written in formal script. She recognized one of them at once. Louis Mornay. Her fingers clenched at her sides. The name burned, dragging memories up like roots ripped from soil, her brother's voice arguing late into the night, the echo of boots on stone, the emptiness left behind. Louis had vanished 2 years earlier after trying to protest the seizure of several tenant plots, including the one her family had worked for decades. The official word had been that he fled arrest. She had never believed it. She stepped away from the desk. It was dangerous to see what she was not meant to see. More dangerous to know what others preferred to keep buried. Still, part of her, a voice she had tried to ignore since the day she arrived, wanted to open those ledgers, to turn the pages and follow the trail that had started in her village and led her all the way to Bellegarde. A rustle outside the window made her glance up, but it was only the wind, stirring the ivy that climbed the outer walls. She turned back toward the shelves. Some of the books bore estate seals on their spines, records, accounts, correspondence. Others were military volumes, maps, collections of essays in Latin and French. At the far end, a cabinet stood ajar. Inside it, she saw rows of drawers, each labeled with a year. She should not have touched them, but her hands moved before her mind had time to scold them. She reached for one drawer, marked 1845, and pulled it gently open. Receipts, letters. A bound notebook with the estate's insignia pressed in gold on the cover. She opened it to the first page and felt her breath hitch. Names, dates, payments. Some of the entries were marked in black ink, others crossed out entirely, and one column, uncategorized, contained notes. Remitted, refused, silent. Others bore no explanation at all, just names, crossed in red. Her finger stopped on one of them. Benoit Moreau, her father. Her stomach turned. She snapped the notebook shut and slipped it back into the drawer with controlled urgency, her pulse climbing now, loud in her ears. She replaced the drawer carefully, forcing herself to breathe, to think, to be silent. A click sounded behind her. The latch on the door. She turned. Armand stood in the doorway, his coat still open from outside, dust clinging to the cuffs of his shirt. His eyes locked onto hers, then shifted to the open cabinet. The quiet that followed was absolute. He closed the door behind him. Neither of them spoke. Slowly, he stepped into the room. The light from the window struck the side of his face, casting the other half into shadow. He didn't ask what she had seen. He didn't need to. He crossed the room, stopping in front of her with a calm that felt far more dangerous than anger. His gaze moved from the cabinet, to her hands, to her face. His voice was very quiet. "How long have you been watching me?" Solene's mouth was dry. She couldn't summon the words. They wouldn't have mattered. He stepped closer. His presence filled the space around her, heavy and unyielding. "You're not here to clean." Her breath came shallow now. She didn't deny it. He reached past her and pressed the cabinet door shut with the barest touch of his hand. Then he looked down at her, his voice a whisper. "Who sent you?" Still she said nothing. He turned from her abruptly, crossing to the desk. With a sharp gesture, he swept the journal and pages aside and pulled a fresh sheet of parchment from a drawer. "Speak," he said, "now, or I begin writing your dismissal." Solene stepped forward before she could stop herself. Her voice came out rougher than she meant. "I came here on my own." He didn't stop writing. "For what purpose?" "I'm not here to steal from you," she said, "or spy for anyone. What I want, what I need, is already yours. I only needed to find it." He paused, pen suspended. Then he turned his head slowly to face her. "What is it you believe you've found?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped toward the desk, her hand resting lightly on its edge, near the scattered pages. He moved them aside and opened one of the ledgers she hadn't touched. Ran his finger down a list of allocations, land parcels, tenant names, amounts owed. Some lines were crossed through. Some names bore annotations she could only guess at. He turned the book to face her. "Read." She looked down. She couldn't. The numbers blurred. The lines shifted. Then he spoke again. "Do you think I'm the one who ordered these names struck through?" She didn't speak. He closed the book. Because I did not. There was a moment of silence where only the soft rattle of leaves outside filled the space. Solenne's voice came, low and quiet. But you didn't stop it either. The truth settled between them like dust on cold marble. He didn't flinch. I inherited an estate-bleeding coin. I was given ledgers, not explanations. And what did you do with them? She asked. He didn't answer. She looked away, to the fireless hearth, the cabinet, the ledgers. I never wanted to come here, she said softly, but Bellegarde was the only place left with answers. He stepped around the desk and faced her again. What answers? I don't know, she whispered. But she did. Not all of them, but enough. Her family's name. Her brother's disappearance. The land they lost, and the silence that followed. Armand studied her, his eyes unreadable. Then he turned toward the cabinet again, pulled another drawer, and took out a folded paper. Sealed. Addressed, but not yet sent. He set it on the desk between them. You need to tell me everything, he said. Solène opened her mouth, and a knock interrupted them. Armand stiffened. He opened the door with a swift pull. In the hallway stood a page boy, young, pale, breathless. He held a letter in his outstretched hand. It's for her, the boy said. Armand took it, frowning. He turned back to Solène. The envelope bore no seal. He handed it to her without a word. She opened it. Inside, a single line of careful script. I know why you're at Bellegarde. Be careful. He doesn't. The room turned soundless as Solène stared at the letter in her hand, the thin paper trembling faintly between her fingers. The words were simple. 7 of them, penned in a tight, practiced script. No signature, no seal, no mark to trace. But they landed in her chest, like a stone dropped into still water. The quiet ripple of panic began to spread before she could stop it. Armand didn't speak. His eyes scanned her face, and she knew he was watching every shift in her expression, waiting for her to hand the letter over. But she didn't. Her hand curled around it instead, folding it once along the seam, then again. Who sent it? He asked. She swallowed hard. There's no name. He extended his palm. Let me see. Solène hesitated only a fraction too long before placing the letter in his waiting hand. His eyes scanned the words once, then again. His jaw tightened as he folded the paper and slipped it into the drawer behind him without comment. Someone in this house knows more than I do, he said, and they want you frightened. She didn't answer. Her eyes dropped to the desk, then the ledgers. Something about the gesture, the quiet insertion of the letter into the drawer, felt final, like a door being shut before she'd had a chance to decide whether to step through. Have you spoken to anyone? He asked. Any staff? No. No friends among the servants? She lifted her chin. They don't exactly invite friendships here. He watched her carefully. Then someone's watching. Closely enough to know why you're here. He said it without accusation, but the implication stood between them. She looked down, and her fingers clenched slightly at her sides. What I've done hasn't been to harm you. Armand leaned back slightly, resting one hand on the edge of the desk. Then what have you done? I've read names, she answered. Numbers, patterns. I followed the trail of what was taken. From your family. She nodded. He took a breath through his nose and looked past her, toward the window. Did you find what you were looking for? Not yet. He turned his head slowly toward her. But you will. I intend to try. Their eyes locked. The tension in the air was no longer cold. It had a pulse now. Quiet but unmistakable, like the deep hum of something coming awake beneath the surface. I'll give you access to the records, Armand said. She blinked, startled. What? He didn't repeat it. You want the truth? He said. So do I. She didn't respond immediately. The words landed with more weight than she expected. She had thought herself alone in this. had trained herself to move as if no one else could be trusted. But now, standing here in his study, with his offer echoing in her ears, the world tilted slightly beneath her feet. He reached behind him and pulled out the sealed letter he had set aside before the page interrupted them. "I was going to send this to the magistrate," he said, requesting a full audit of the estate's ledgers. Solène stared at him. "You were?" He met her gaze. "After today's outburst in the courtyard, I realized there were patterns I hadn't bothered to notice. Someone has been hiding things from me." She said nothing, but her breath quickened. "I don't protect thieves," he said, "even when they wear my family's crest." He placed the sealed envelope on the desk again, then added, quietly, "But if you continue to hide from me, I can't protect you either." The truth in his voice, raw and spare, stole her words. "I'll have the steward bring the accounts from the last 3 years," he said, "and I want you to tell me everything you know about your brother." The air thickened between them. She nodded. A knock broke the silence, and he stepped away to answer. One of the guards stood at the door. "Monseigneur, there's unrest in the lower village. Words spread from this morning's incident. They're calling for explanation." Armand ran a hand through his hair. "Ready my horse." The guard bowed and left. Solène watched him cross the room again, collecting his gloves and a leather satchel. "You're going down there yourself?" she asked. "Yes. If they feel abandoned, they'll turn angry fast. I won't leave it to messengers." He stopped near the door. "I want you to stay here. Review the books when they arrive. Don't leave the study." She nodded again. He gave her one last glance, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, then left without another word. The silence he left behind was different than before. Not tense, but charged. Like the weight in the room had shifted from suspicion to something more fragile, something that required care. Solène crossed to the desk and sat slowly, her hands resting on the smooth surface of the wood. A crack in the varnish ran along the edge. The papers beside it were still scattered from earlier. She straightened them, then sat back and waited. The minutes passed slowly. Beyond the window, clouds began to roll in, heavy with late summer rain. The smell of approaching storm thickened the air. The trees bent under sudden wind, and the vine rose rippled again, less gently this time. A knock startled her. She stood quickly, unsure whether to expect the steward or Armand returned too soon. But it was neither. A man she hadn't seen before stepped into the study. Late middle-aged, with graying sideburns and a trim black coat. He wore no livery. "I was told to bring the ledgers," he said, his voice polite. Solène nodded. "You're the steward?" "Until this morning," he said flatly. "I've just been relieved." She froze. "You've been dismissed." He met her gaze directly. The prince did not give a reason. Her mouth dried. "I assume you're the one who gave him cause." She didn't reply. He stepped forward and placed a stack of bound volumes on the edge of the desk, then paused. "I was loyal to this estate," he said. "You'll find my work meticulous. But be careful what you look for. It's not always wise to wake ghosts." Then he turned and left. The door clicked shut behind him. Solène sat slowly. She opened the first ledger, the leather stiff and cool beneath her hands. Names filled the pages, some familiar, some not. She began scanning line by line, trailing her finger down each entry, searching. Hour after hour passed. The storm broke outside. Rain battered the windows, wind howled through the shutters, and thunder cracked over the vineyard hills. She lit a candle as the room dimmed. In the flickering light, something shifted. A line of ink stood out on the third page of the second ledger. Her name. Moreau, Solène. Noted beside a code she didn't recognize. Cross-referenced with another. Her heart stuttered. She flipped to the second code, an internal note marked only with the initials of the former steward. Her name was listed again. And under it, a sentence in cold, precise script. Observation confirmed. Monitor closely. Do not engage without instruction. Solène recoiled from the page as if burned. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping behind her. She had not been as invisible as she believed. And someone had been watching. From the beginning. She turned to the door, meaning to find Armand. But before her hand reached the latch, she stopped. Footsteps. Quiet. Unhurried. Moving just outside the corridor. Then a voice. Soft, amused. I was wondering when you'd start reading the right pages. The voice came from just beyond the half-closed study door. Low, smooth, and edged with amusement that didn't match the weight in Solène's chest. She froze, her hand hovering inches from the latch, and for a long second she didn't breathe. Outside, the storm raged on. Rain struck the windows in hard, gust-driven sheets, casting fleeting shadows across the rug beneath her feet. A distant rumble of thunder shuddered through the glass panes. The candlelight flickered violently, throwing her silhouette against the far wall. The door creaked. Solène stepped back before it fully opened. The man who entered wore no coat, no uniform, no mark of position. But she recognized him instantly, the steward who had been dismissed earlier that afternoon, the same one who had delivered the ledgers with quiet civility and a veiled warning. Now, with his black waistcoat unbuttoned and his collar damp from the rain, he looked less like a man of order and more like a man unbound from it. I hoped you'd find that page, he said, closing the door behind him without asking permission. It was difficult, you know, keeping you from seeing it too soon. You have a frustrating talent for subtlety. Solène's hands clenched at her sides. You've been watching me. Not alone. He stepped deeper into the room, glancing toward the ledgers spread across the desk. But yes, since your name first appeared in our personnel records. Why? Because you don't belong here. His words held no insult, no disdain, only simple observation. But the chill they sent down her spine was unmistakable. She didn't move as he crossed toward the hearth, casting a quick glance at the cabinet where the older estate records were kept. You should have left after the first week, he went on. If you had, we might have avoided this moment. She stared at him, barely able to keep her voice steady. You forged those ledgers. A faint smile tugged at his mouth. No, I allowed them to evolve. Massaged them, perhaps, with care. You stole from the tenants. You erased names. He tilted his head. Adjusted. Reallocated. You think a place like Bellegarde runs clean? You think every acre harvested and every coin spent can be accounted for in ink alone? You profited from it. I preserved it. The words landed like gravel. He moved closer to the desk, fingertips brushing one of the open ledgers. The prince, your winter prince. He was too distracted to see what was needed. Too removed, too principled. So I stepped in. You ruined lives. And protected his legacy. No one else would have kept the accounts solvent when the vineyards failed last spring, or during the plague 3 winters ago. Someone had to choose who ate and who didn't. I made those choices. He turned to face her. And then you arrived. With your quiet curiosity, your eyes that don't lower. The candle flickered between them, casting golden lines across the scar on his jaw she hadn't noticed before. You had no right, she said. Her voice broke, just slightly. I had every right, he replied. He left the accounts in my hands. I did what was required. She took a step toward him, her hands clenched now. Did you do what was required to my brother? To Louis? He didn't blink. I don't recall every name. You crossed his out in red. He gave a small shrug. Then I must have had reason. The room vibrated with silence. Solène's pulse thundered in her throat. The ledger on the desk lay open to the page where her brother's name had been struck through, alongside a note written in the same script as the steward's own. Monitor closely. Do not engage without instruction. What does that mean? She asked, pointing to the note. He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It means we knew who you were before you arrived. We allowed you to stay because we thought you'd burn yourself out. But then you got clever." He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, the same note Solène had received earlier that day. "I wrote this." She stared at him. "I knew you'd tell the prince eventually, that your sense of virtue would get the better of you. So I gave you just enough warning to shake you. If it made you leave, good. If it made you stay, well, then we'd have to accelerate things." He unfolded the letter and held it toward the flame, letting it catch. The parchment curled in seconds, blackening at the edges, disintegrating into ash before it reached the rug. Solène didn't move. "I don't work here anymore," he said, "but you and I both know it isn't over." She drew a breath, deep and cold. "You threatened me in your own handwriting, in the prince's study." He smiled wider, showing teeth. "You think he'd believe you? You think he'd believe I walked in here and confessed to theft, coercion, and a missing brother, without a witness?" Her heart sank. She didn't trust Armand easily, but she also knew enough of nobility to understand how quickly the air around her could change if one accusation failed to land. "And what will you do now?" she asked. "I'll vanish, for now. But Bellegarde will miss me. And when your prince tires of his little reformation, when the coin runs dry again, he'll understand what he threw away." He turned toward the door, then paused. "You were never supposed to matter, but now that you do." His eyes flicked over her once more. "Be very careful where you look next. Some truths don't forgive the people who uncover them." He stepped out, shutting the door behind him so softly it barely clicked. The moment stretched. Solène moved to the desk, gripping the edge with both hands. Her breath came too fast, too shallow. The candlelight swam in her vision. She forced herself to stand still, to count, to focus on the ledger before her. She didn't know how long she stood like that before another knock came. This one was brisk, authoritative. The door opened before she could speak. Armand stepped inside, rain on his coat, his hair damp, boots tracking water across the rug. "I spoke with the village elders," he said, voice tight. "There are names missing from their rent books, names that match your list. I told them I would investigate immediately." She opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. Because behind him, in the corridor, a second figure appeared, older, gray-haired, holding a folded document and an expression carved from stone. "I'm sorry to intrude, Monseigneur," the man said to Armand, "but you need to see this." He handed the document to the prince. Armand took it, brows drawing together as he unfolded the page. Then his entire body went still. Solène stepped forward, her voice dry. "What is it?" He turned the paper toward her, and there, pressed in black ink at the bottom, was her name. And below it, in the steward's same meticulous hand, "Final clearance approved. Immediate removal advised." The room chilled. Solène stared at the words on the page, her own name beneath those 4 clipped directives that seemed to erase her right to exist. Final clearance approved. Immediate removal advised. The handwriting was familiar now, precise, slanted, too neat for anything but calculation. It didn't shout, didn't threaten. It didn't need to. Armand's eyes scanned the page again, his jaw set so tightly she could see the movement of his teeth clenched beneath the lean angle of his cheek. The gray-haired man who'd delivered the document lingered at the threshold, his posture rigid, as if afraid that proximity alone might pull him into a storm not meant for him. "Where did you get this?" Armand asked, his voice quiet and dangerous. The man replied evenly. "It was found among the steward's outgoing correspondence, sir. Slipped inside a bundle destined for Bordeaux." Solène's heart dropped. Her throat tightened around the shape of a breath she couldn't seem to find. Armand folded the paper slowly, precisely, then turned toward her. The expression on his face had changed. The tension remained, but something colder had moved in behind his gaze. an anger so sharply restrained it became a blade in itself. "You were a target," he said. "From the beginning." Solène nodded once, the smallest motion. "I didn't know how deep it went." He looked at the letter again, then reached for the edge of the desk, gripping it with one gloved hand. This was more than theft. This was silencing. Every time you got close, he tightened the noose. "I think my brother," her voice faltered. "I think that's what happened to Louis." His eyes lifted sharply to hers. "He was on their list, too. I saw the name crossed out in red. Then we don't wait." He turned toward the man still at the doorway. "I want every ledger copy, every outgoing document from the steward's office brought to my chambers. And I want 2 guards posted at the archives, no access granted without my written order." "Yes, Monseigneur." The door closed behind him, leaving them alone again. The rain had quieted to a whisper outside, but inside, the walls of Bellegarde felt as if they had absorbed every drop of storm water, thick, cold, and heavy with old rot. Solène pressed a hand to the edge of the desk, grounding herself. "You believe me now." Armand faced her fully, his expression unreadable. "I never disbelieved you. But I didn't see the danger. I should have." She watched him, searching for what lay beneath his calm. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't let panic crack through his tone. And yet his movements were sharper now, more deliberate. His restraint, once icy, now carried weight. He was no longer simply the prince behind the desk. He was a man preparing for war within his own house. "I think he knew I was close," she said. "That I was going to tell you. He set this in motion before I even dismissed him." The ledger still lay open on the desk, Solène's name on one page, her father's on another. Between them, only silence and ink. She glanced at the candle beside it, the flame now soft and unsteady, as if shrinking from the weight of the room. Armand walked to the window and looked out into the darkening courtyard. A few footmen carried crates beneath oilcloth, hurrying toward the wine cellars. One of the stable hands was leading a lathered horse toward the paddock, rain dripping from the animal's flanks. "He'll run," Armand said, almost to himself. "If he hasn't already." He said as much. That drew his gaze back to her. "You saw him again?" "In this room, after you left for the village." His brow furrowed. "He admitted to everything," she said. "Not by name, but enough. He burned the letter he sent me. Told me Bellegarde would need him again." Armand's expression didn't change, but his silence lengthened. "I think he believes that," Solène added. "That without him, this place will collapse." Armand returned to the desk and picked up the folded document again. His fingers creased the edge slowly, then refolded it. "I built this estate on tradition, on loyalty, but I didn't realize how much of it was rot beneath the surface." She didn't speak. He stepped around the desk and stopped in front of her. The air between them felt thin now, as if every word they exchanged narrowed the space. "I need you to stay," he said. She looked up at him. "You don't need my permission. I need your trust." The candle guttered. The ledger pages rustled faintly in the draft. "Staying might not be safe," she said. "No," he agreed. "Not yet." She held his gaze a moment longer, then gave a slow, measured nod. He turned to the papers again, but before he could reach for the next ledger, a sharp rap echoed at the door. He answered it himself. A guard entered, hat in hand, boots dripping from the wet stones outside. His expression was tight. "Forgive the interruption, sir. A courier arrived at the south gate not 10 minutes ago. He was looking for a stable master. But what he carried? It was addressed to you." Armand held out his hand. The guard produced a sealed letter. The wax bore no crest. Armand broke it and unfolded the paper. He read it once, then twice. His brow furrowed, then his features went utterly still. Solène stepped forward. "What is it?" He held the paper out to her. She read it quickly, heart climbing in her chest. It was a report from a clerk in Bordeaux, someone she didn't know. But the final line stood out in dark, hurried ink. The steward boarded a private coach bound south through the forest road. He was not alone. The fire had long gone out in the hearth, but neither of them had moved to relight it. The storm had passed some time before dawn, leaving the chateau soaked and subdued, the earth outside swollen and the air tinged with damp stone and wood smoke. A quiet, grey light filtered through the tall windows of the study, casting long shadows over the ledgers still open on the desk. Solène stood near the window, her arms folded tightly across her waist, watching the slow rise of mist curling over the vineyards. The message from the courier, received only hours earlier, remained on the desk, its single sentence etched into her mind like the last words of a confession. The steward was gone. He had left under cover of storm, with time enough to vanish into the southern woods before anyone could pursue him. But what lingered wasn't only the bitterness of his escape. It was the uncertainty of who had gone with him. The line "he was not alone" had stirred something in Solène that sleep could not touch. She hadn't closed her eyes since. Behind her, Armand paced. Not in frustration, but in controlled movement, like a man measuring each step to match the rhythm of thought. He hadn't removed his coat since returning. His gloves lay discarded on the arm of the chair, his boots damp, leaving faint prints on the rugs. But he said nothing about any of it. His silence was no longer cold or detached. It was watchful. Waited. "There's more than one name missing from the records," Solène said quietly, without turning. "Some of them are listed under false allocations, but others, whole families, just vanish after a certain year. No sale, no transfer, no death certificate." He stopped. She turned to face him. If he was moving people out of Bellegarde to cover losses, or to secure the land for himself, then he wasn't acting alone, Armand finished. She nodded. They had worked through the night, side by side, he cross-checking tenant records against military tax rolls, she combing through lists of estate purchases, land seizures, and debt collections. The web was larger than either of them had expected. Deeper. It stretched beyond Bellegarde, into the magistrates' offices of Bordeaux, perhaps even further. But what struck Armand the most was not just the fraud. It was the silence that surrounded it, the deliberate ease with which names were erased, the ease with which he had not noticed. "There are letters to draft," he said after a moment, his voice low. "Not only to the local prefect, but to the archiving office in Libourne. I want formal inquiries into every name you've listed. We'll need confirmation from the registry." She watched him as he spoke. Not only the clarity in his decisions, but the shift in him that had happened slowly, almost imperceptibly, since the first moment she had refused to remove her shoes on his carpet. "I can send word to Saint-Emilion," she offered. "There's a man there who kept accounts for the church. He might still have copies of land documents going back before the seizures began." He nodded. "Do it." She reached for a sheet of parchment, drew the inkwell closer. Armand circled the desk to sit beside her, and the two of them began to write, separately, but in rhythm. The scratching of their quills was the only sound for a long while, interrupted only by the occasional lift of eyes, the exchange of a document, the murmur of agreement. When the morning bell rang out across the courtyard, signaling the servants to rise, neither of them stirred. A knock came at the study door. One of the new guards stood waiting, reins still clinging to the brim of his hat. "Monseigneur, the estate cart is ready to carry the letters into the village." "Good." Armand handed over 2 sealed scrolls. "Take these to the courier post. No delay." The guard bowed and withdrew. Solène turned back to the ledgers, then paused, lifting one of the original lists, the red-marked ledger that had begun everything. She traced her finger along the edges, then rested it beside her brother's name. "Louis tried to stop this 2 years ago," she said. "He petitioned the mayor. He sent letters to the land court, but no one replied. No one even acknowledged the petition." Armand was silent. "He vanished a month later," He looked at her. "I'll find out where he was sent, or what happened to him." She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. It was there, between them, unspoken. She folded the ledger shut and leaned back in the chair. Her shoulders ached. Her hands were ink-stained. But the weight she had carried when she first entered Bellegarde, the quiet, lonely burden of knowing something was wrong and being too small to name it, had begun to lift. "I don't know what happens next," she said. "Neither do I," Armand replied. "But we don't go back to what it was." The study fell into a hush again, but it was no longer brittle, no longer the silence of secrets and withheld breath. It was a pause before something else, something beginning. Outside, the mist had started to rise. The first fingers of sunlight reached over the vineyard rows, gilding the wet leaves, turning them into hundreds of tiny mirrors. A new day had arrived, quietly, but it had arrived all the same. Solène stood and crossed to the tall window once more. She didn't flinch when she heard his footsteps behind her. He came to stand beside her, not too close, not as prince to servant, but as something else now. Something unfinished, but real. The estate stretched before them, rows of soil and stone and vine, reclaimed inch by inch. "I want to see it made right," she said. He looked at her, then back out at the land that had belonged to his family for generations. "So do I," he said. The harvest celebration came late that year. The rain had delayed the final cutting of grapes, and though the vineyards ripened under the September sun, the mood in the village below Bellegarde remained uncertain. The scandal had spread in hushed circles, servants whispering over washbasins, farmers pausing mid-plow to murmur rumors into calloused hands. But no one left, no one revolted. They watched, and the prince did not disappear behind shuttered windows. Armand made no announcement. He posted no public statement. But word traveled quickly when 3 tenant families who had once vanished from the records were restored to their lands. When a former clerk from the town hall was hired to review all backlogged complaints. When the ledgers, the real ledgers, were hand-delivered to a legal office in Bordeaux by the prince's own valet. The house began to breathe again. In the west wing, where the light touched the rooms only in the late hours of morning, Solène's quarters had changed. Not grandly. She still lived modestly, with a small fireplace and a single writing desk. But the narrow mattress had been replaced with one that didn't sag, and the rusted basin with a proper ceramic bowl and pitcher. A window now overlooked the south fields, and though she said nothing of it, the view stretched precisely over the vineyard her family once worked. She spent her mornings in the study. The estate steward had not been replaced in title, but Armand no longer reviewed the accounts alone. They read side by side, sometimes in silence, sometimes in quiet debate, the shared space of the desk slowly becoming familiar. Not comfortable, not yet, but less guarded. She brought the clarity he lacked. He brought the weight she no longer feared. They did not speak of her brother again. Not yet. They both knew there were still names to search for, documents to retrieve, lives to account for. But grief, true grief, required stillness. And for now, neither of them could afford it. The day of the harvest fete arrived with gold in the sky and a soft, sun-warmed breeze. The vineyards had already been picked, the carts brought in, the grapes pressed in the old stone house where the village children dared one another to sneak inside. The fields smelled of crushed vines, fruit, and drying hay. A string of colored cloths fluttered between the buildings in the square. Musicians tuned their fiddles and polished the brass mouthpieces of horns. Women brought loaves still warm from their ovens. Someone roasted a whole boar over coals on the southern hill. It was Solène who hesitated at the door. She stood just outside the chateau's entrance, her hands folded tightly beneath her shawl, watching as villagers gathered near the bonfire, the music already rising into the blue air. Bells rang. Someone laughed, but she did not move to join them. The staff had offered her a place to walk with the other housemaids. But it wasn't the right path anymore. and yet she wasn't sure which one was. Then the door behind her opened. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. Armand stepped out, his coat unbuttoned, his gloves forgotten. He looked less like a prince and more like a man emerging from the weight of his own house. He paused beside her, saying nothing. She didn't look at him. After a beat, he extended his arm. She stared at it, at the cut of his sleeve, the space between them. The eyes that watched from across the square, some in silence, some in surprise. Then she slid her hand through the crook of his elbow. They walked together down the gravel path, past the outer gates, into the open space of the celebration. No one spoke to them at first. A group of children froze mid-game. A young man dropped a basket of apples, but the musicians didn't stop. The fiddler kept playing, the bow flying over strings as if the tune itself would carry the day past its moment of pause. The pair walked once around the perimeter of the square. Armand said little, Solène even less. But when a child stumbled in front of them and nearly collided with Armand's boots, he reached down without hesitation and set him back on his feet. The boy scampered away. The crowd exhaled. It began then, slowly. An old woman offered Solène a piece of honeyed bread. A vintner bowed awkwardly and pressed a glass of new wine into Armand's hand. A maid who had once refused to speak more than 2 words to Solène now smiled. The tension loosened. Not vanished, but altered. Later, near sunset, they walked up the hill behind the square, away from the crowd, toward the row of poplars that bordered the path to the upper fields. The wind tugged at Solène's shawl. Her slippers were damp with grass. The sunlight broke in gold between the trees, painting the world in soft, final warmth. She paused near the edge of the hilltop. Armand stopped beside her, but didn't speak. Below, the land stretched wide, vineyards in rows like lines on a parchment, dotted with stone cottages and low walls. Beyond them, the darker green of forest, the glint of river water in the last light. I used to think, she said finally, that this place was a house of ghosts. He turned to her. And now? She didn't answer right away. It's still haunted, she said. But some ghosts are worth listening to. He said nothing, but she felt his gaze on her. She looked up, searching his face. You've changed. So have you. The wind lifted again. She looked back at the horizon, the line of gold nearly fading behind the hills. I won't stay forever, she said softly. There are things I still need to finish. I know, but I'll stay until it's done. His hand brushed hers, not by accident. She let it rest there. They stood like that as the last of the sun disappeared, the air cooling, the smell of wood smoke rising behind them. Below, the music swelled again. And for the first time since she had stepped foot inside Bellegarde, Solène did not feel like she had entered someone else's world. She felt as if she had helped build it. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.